Welcome remarks by Andy Boynton. Let me read that. Isn't it great to be here? Go Eagles! Yeah. How many of you are BC alum? Could all of you, we'll start in the back, go around the room, introduce yourself, what year you graduated, a little bit about yourself, and we'll just, no? How many of you have children at BC or have had any children? Okay, great. How many want children here now? We can pay the tuition and all that now. Well, thank you for joining us. The 19th Annual Finance Conference, and hosted by the Seidner Department of Finance. We're going to have a great day. I'm just going to roll through this because I'm standing between you and people far more interesting than I am. But I was reflecting upstairs. We had a small breakfast. I came onto this campus in 1974 as a freshman. And Peter Markell, who was living, he's in the audience. Peter is a very successful executive and leader. I'm a half-baked academic, but I did okay. But, you know, as an IMD, I did a lot. But Peter said, we never knew you were that smart, IMD, UVA. So we were reminiscing back to our days in Casca. BC was very good to me. It planted some great seeds, and it was great, like, for all of you. I'm also a parent of a graduate of Boston College. I think we're all proud of the university and where it's come since we were here as students. And I and everybody should be especially proud of the Seidner Department of Finance, the conveners of today's conference. It's a great, I'll talk a little bit more about it. It's really an elite academic department of great scholars and great teachers. I want to especially thank University trustee Mark Seidner and my friend, class of 1988, a BC parent, his tremendous generosity to the university, to the Carroll School, and to the Seidner Department of Finance. So, Mark, thank you. Would you stand up? You don't want to, but you don't want to. He's right here. Hey, look, here's the real deal. We're ending the school year. I'm exhausted. I'm heading to the beaches of Nantucket to fish all summer. Good luck. But the fact is, many of you have been very successful by any measure. And many of you, and almost all of you, have been so generous with Boston College. And I'm trying to give back in my own way, you know, being the dean now for 20 years at a Carroll School. But all of us and all of you, I think, should be proud of where the university has come. And thank you to all of you that have helped build BC, the Carroll School, and whatever financial aid, whatever. Thank you all. And the department really is amongst one of the top departments in the world. And in the recent U.S. News rankings, finance was ranked, let's see, what does it say here? Number 6 in the country. And I just want to say, for top business schools, finance is really the crown jewel. It's what you want to be good at. It's serious rigor. It's built fundamentally, mostly on economics or behavioral economics. And the B6, you look at that list, you're going to have Harvard, MIT, Wharton, Berkeley, NYU is very good. I mean, being in New York's not a bad thing. Stanford, I'm missing some. You get the point. Those are elite universities, and our finance department is right there as number 6. And I want to thank someone who has been a leader, the senior chair, associate dean in the School for Faculty, the finance department chairperson, now a good friend of mine. We go through a lot of battles together. We're in the trenches together every day. I would like Ronnie Sotka, who runs this finance department and really builds it in a collaborative way, yet sets the direction and the tone for Ever to Excel. Ronnie isn't from BC, but there's no one I know who lives Ever to Excel day to day more than Ronnie Sotka. Ronnie, would you stand up? We want to thank you for all you've done. I want to honor you right now. Where's Ronnie? Yeah, Ronnie's view, and he'll say it, we'll say, if you don't want to be great, why bother? Right? If you're not trying to be great, what are you doing? And that's Ever to Excel. Also, it's not just Ronnie who's done it. You know, he's kind of been the leader, but it takes a village. And there's many young and older finance faculty in the room. And when I say they're great scholars, they are. You wouldn't be ranked number 6. The elite journals, the best journals, the great books. They're also great teachers. I mean, it's unbelievable. And if you have children at BC, they'll tell you. And there's a reason why finance is the largest major on campus and the largest minor on campus. It's not because everybody wants a finance job. It's because they know this faculty is great teachers. So with all the faculty from the Seidner Department of Finance, would you all, some are here today, stand up. I see any faculty member, stand up back there. Matthias, everybody stand. You're looking at a talented group of people, believe it or not, despite what they look like. Also this year, in doing this preparation, co-chair Mark Seidner, who you know, Dan Holland is a co-chair, Professor Jonathan Reuter, who's in our finance department. They've all worked hard with me. They put this together. We think about it. And I want to thank Dan and John for their efforts. And it's a pleasure now for me to introduce Dan. And also, wait, I have your Nick Burns. You're with us. You made it. Nick, just stand up so everybody can see you. Stand up. There's Nick. Well, it's great to have him. Nick was a classmate of mine, graduated from BC in 1978. We didn't know each other then. I spent all my time in Casca, in my room, in the library, or in the Plex playing basketball. So for some reason, we never crossed paths. But we've become good friends since. And Nick will be speaking in a few moments. He is preparing to release his new book on U.S.-China relations, and he has lived it, being the most former recent ambassador to China. And what's interesting about Nick, he's a great guy. But when you think about the world of academia and thinking and so forth, Nick doesn't just think about it and write about it. He's been there. He knows the people. He's been in the countries. He's been involved with NATO. He was ambassador to NATO when 9/11 happened and invoked, is it Article 13, Nick? Article 5? All right. I wasn't political science major. But the point is, Nick has been there, and we're going to hear from him today. And it's always a gift to hear from Nick Burns. But now I'd like to turn things over to Dan Holland, who's going to once again be the master of ceremonies for the day. Dan will formally introduce Nick in a few moments. But Dan is the chief operating officer. He used to work for Goldman Sachs, retired from Goldman. He's now the chief operating officer at Shield Capital. Shield Capital. It's a venture capital firm, and it's focused on investing in a very interesting area: commercial technology and national security in the areas of cybersecurity, space, autonomy, and artificial intelligence. So Dan is really seeing these firms that are in the cutting edge in those important kind of technology areas. And prior to joining Shield, as I mentioned, he spent 35 years at Goldman Sachs, but he didn't get enough. He didn't retire. He's now the chief operating officer at Shield Capital. Dan has a ton of energy. In his last role in Goldman, Dan managed the firm's private wealth management business in New England. Today, Dan serves as chairman of the advisory board for the Carroll School of Management at BC. He's helped me for years as an advisor, helping direct the Carroll School's strategic direction. He's also chairman emeritus of the Naval War College Foundation, and he's overseer of the USS Constitution Museum. Why are you so busy in retirement? It's unbelievable. I'm sure she's real happy. Dan holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from BC, and as I mentioned, 1978, when we graduated. He also has an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
How about a quick round of applause for Andy Boynton? No one has done more for this school than Andy Boynton. We'll hear more about Andy in a minute. Well, good morning. Thank you, Andy. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to help moderate this conference again. How many people are here for the first time? Raise the hands. All right, that's great. It's nice to see some familiar faces. It's nice to see people coming here for the first time. You know, a lot goes into the planning around this, and at the end of each year, we say, well, what are we going to do next year? And this is now the 19th annual, and we used to count them out, but now, as you can see, we just call it the Finance Conference 2026. Now that we have Mr. Seidner's name on the front of it, it is the Finance Conference, like the country club down the street. So thank you, Mark. We appreciate that. So the beauty of finance is there's something new all the time to talk about. And so whatever we plan after the last conference, the world changes and we have new things to talk about. And that's the excitement of finance, and that's what brings us here together today to talk about ideas. We usually have a section on geopolitics. And we've had some really tremendous world thinkers here. We've had the late, great Ash Carter. We've had General Jim Mattis. We've had Richard Haas. A number of folks. We've had Nick before. But it's hard to think about finance without thinking about geopolitics. And my own opinion is I think that markets have a difficult time assessing geopolitical risk. And they tend to just look past it. And they increase volatility measures, and they think about what happens to oil and things like that. But a lot of the models in finance just don't model geopolitical risk. I think it's really hard to do. And Ronnie, maybe it's a topic for one of your brilliant professors to think about it in other years. So the topic for the next speaker that Ambassador Burns is going to talk about is pretty daunting, and the title is actually the Unraveling. Let me see if I have it exactly right. The Global Order Unraveling, Wars in Iran and Ukraine, the China Challenge, and U.S. Foreign Policy. And I said to the ambassador on the way down, I said, I really don't envy you trying to cover all those topics in an hour. And I said, any one of those would be a full day's conference. He said, no, Dan, you're wrong. Any one of those topics would be a semester. And so we're going to ask the ambassador to cover that here in a short bit. I just got back from a trip to Europe. I have 4 brothers, and we went to retrace my father's steps through World War II. And we started at Normandy, and we went through France. We ended up in Germany, where he was at the farthest eastern point on day 1 of the Battle of the Bulge. And if you think about the world order that has been sustained since the end of World War II, which is really a continuation of World War I for all the military historians, it's amazing how that has kept peace and relative peace and relative prosperity for 80 years. And that is dramatically changing. And it's changing because technology has changed the face of warfare, and it's changing the geopolitics. And it's manifesting itself in many places around the world, and the ambassador will help share his thoughts on that. So I'm going to give you the formal introduction. You already heard some of it from Andy, but Ambassador Burns is the Goodman Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's the founder and faculty chair of the Program on Diplomacy and Statecraft, and a faculty affiliate at Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And I think we can all agree that we need more diplomacy and statecraft. He worked in the United States government for over 3 decades, serving 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state across both sides of the political aisle. Most recently, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2021 to 2025, leading servants from 48 U.S. government agencies at the U.S. mission to China, overseeing one of America's most important bilateral relationships. He's the vice chair of the Cohen Group, co-chair of the Aspen Strategy Group, and the Aspen Security Forum, one of the major security forums that we hold in the country. He's received 15 honorary degrees, the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, and too many other awards to list. Importantly, he has a BA in History from Boston College and an MA in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So the ambassador is going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So please formulate your questions, And over to you, Ambassador Burns.
Dan, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you here at Boston College. I drove in this morning. Andy and I were here a long, long time ago together as undergraduates in the 1970s. How far we have come, and how proud I think all of us who are BC alums, BC parents, 2 of our 3 daughters went here, of this college. Proud of Father Leahy's extraordinary 30 years of leadership that has really transformed the school. Proud of our Jesuit tradition and the rigor that comes from, I guess as freshmen, we're being forced to take theology and philosophy. I'm so glad we were forced to take theology and philosophy and trying to build women, men of character. Proud of our athletics. We're in the Yawkey Center. Andy and I went with our wives, our spouses, Libby and Jane, to the BC Notre Dame game. There was a point in the 3rd period I thought we were going to win. We went to the BC UVA game in basketball. Proud of all the success here, but even more proud of the academics and of the rigor in this school. I was arts and sciences, and my dad kept telling me, you need to take more economics, and he was right. I probably should have been here at the Carroll School of Management as well. But just so proud to be back here at Boston College, so thank you all for being with us. Andy's been a transformative leader of the Carroll School. And I know that Dan, who's been a great citizen of this school, asked us to thank him, but could you all please, one more time, thank this gentleman. And he's given me a really easy task this morning. He said, discuss the war and peace challenges to the United States of America. So we figured, have to talk about Iran. How are we going to get out of this standoff in the Strait of Hormuz? We have to talk about Putin's invasion of Ukraine and, frankly, the recent transformation of that war. And I want to say a few words about the U.S.-China relationship. I lived it over the last 4 years with my incredible team of public servants from all over our government, and I think the most complicated and complex relationship that the United States has. And I'm going to do that very briefly. But I wanted to start with, before I get to those 3 issues, I wanted to start with maybe a larger thought, which is not unique to me, but it's a concern that many of us have. And this is about risk. And it's about the future, and it's about how businesses need to prepare for this future, and countries do. We are moving, maybe slowly, but probably inexorably, from a world of order to a world of disorder. So what do I mean by that? Dan just talked about his dad, World War II. My dad was also in the Marine Corps in that war. I bet if we went around the room, fathers, mothers, maybe if you're on the younger side, grandparents, that greatest generation that brought us through the Great Depression and the Second World War. We are the inheritors of how they thought about the world and how it should be structured following the war. So our inheritance is a world of order. And it was the great insights, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, who didn't live to see the end of the war, died April 12, 1945, but certainly with Harry Truman, with Dwight D. Eisenhower, with General George C. Marshall, Dean Acheson, and then even the younger people who fought in that war, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, Lieutenant Richard Nixon, 2 young naval officers in the war who became president. They had reflected on the fact most of them were alive during the First World War, 17 million dead. They were all in the Second World War. And now modern historians say about 70 million people died in the Second World War. So they looked at that and the rise of the fascist powers and the total war that it took from 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, to September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrender. They said to themselves, we need to create a world of order. And they did. The United Nations system, the great powers would coalesce and actually work together to try to prevent a third world war, a Stalin invasion of Western Europe. The development banks, from the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank to the regional development banks, the whole tributary system of the United Nations, from UNESCO to UNICEF to the UN Development Program, this would be a world of institutions that were solid, and we could actually plan globally around those institutions, and there were rules. The United Nations Charter, you cannot cross someone's border and take over the country, or try to, as Putin has tried to do. That's the brightest red line in this world of order. And conventions dear to the hearts of the ethics of Boston College. The United Nations Convention on Human Rights that enshrine freedom of speech and freedom of the press and the rule of law. Conventions about how to conduct a just war, which His Holiness Pope Leo has been talking about publicly and reminding us in a Catholic tradition of St. Augustine and a just war. And the United Nations conventions against genocide, against the use of chemical weapons, reflect that kind of thinking. It was a world of order and of institutions from the late 1940s, I think, until very recently, probably the last 5 to 10 years. It was not perfect. We had the Korean War. We had the Vietnam War. We lost 57,000 American troops in Vietnam. We had the Afghan War, a 20-year war. And we had the Iraq War. So it wasn't perfect. But you could plan, if you were in business, around the institutions, around the rules. There were safeguards, and there were, lines of authority that you wouldn't cross. And I'm sorry to depress you all on a beautiful Friday morning, but I think if you look at the world today, we're heading towards a world of disorder. A couple of examples, and there are many. One, that United Nations system, completely atrophied and ineffective. Have we heard anything, and he's a very good man, the UN Secretary General, has he been able to do anything to arrest Russian aggression? No. Or Iranian aggression in the Middle East, or the complex issues of malnutrition and poverty in the poorer parts of the world. The United Nations system is divided between the three democratic powers, Britain, France, and the United States, the people who hold the power in the Security Council, and the Russians and Chinese on the other side, and they veto each other, and we're both responsible for that. So that system cannot produce the kind of decision-making, order, planning, conflict resolution that we have needed. That's example number one. Example number two is probably the most important development in global politics in the last 10 years or so, the rise of the authoritarian powers. And there's 4 of them, and they were all in Tiananmen Square on September 3rd of 2025 to commemorate the end of the Second World War, the defeat of Japan. It was Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea and President Pezeshkian of Iran. And it's not a formal alliance, but they have a lot of self-confidence. They believe in authoritarianism. So dictatorship, the rule of the few, by the few, of the many. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, they're all operating together. Putin crossed the border and has put hundreds of thousands of troops into Ukraine for one person, kill the Ukrainian state, and subsume it into a larger modern Slavic empire with Russia and Belarus and perhaps others. Who's helping him? China is providing, we thought, and when I was in government just 15 months ago, about 90% of the microelectronics, the dual-use technologies that power the Russian defense industrial base. So we have made the case that without that Chinese military support, Russia would be at a standstill and unable to actually prosecute this war. North Korea has put 25,000 troops into eastern Ukraine to fight with the Russians against the Ukrainians. And Iran, Shahed drones. We know a lot about the Shahed drones from the last couple of months. Iran provided Russia with the drones that early in the war were a significant problem for the Ukrainians. So this is a real deal of authoritarianism rising up to say we're the future. And from my time in China, I can tell you, President Xi Jinping is often repeating, the East is rising and the West is falling. So the authoritarian case is, we are yesterday's story. We have been at the apogee of our power, and now we're on a downward slope, and they have the self-confidence and the resources and the unity in the authoritarian world. This is a real problem for us, especially at a time when democracy's on the back foot. You know, just go to Britain, France, Germany, Italy. There's been a positive development from my perspective in Hungary with the departure of Viktor Orban. But each of those other four democracies, the core four democracies in Western Europe, are in some trouble from parties to the extreme right. AfD in Germany, the Reform Party in the United Kingdom, and of course Marine Le Pen, and I say the French fascists, which may right now be in the lead for the presidential election in 2027. So we're at a perilous time when the self-confidence, the power, the movement, the initiative appears to be with the authoritarian countries. A third example of a world creeping towards disorder, and Professor Romer knows a lot more about this than I do, and I'm looking forward to his remarks and honored to be speaking with him today. It's the Wild West tariff reality around the world that's in place. I checked the figures the other day. In early January of 2025, the effective tariff rate of the United States, I think, was 2.6%. That's our average tariff rate towards the rest of the world. Now, even with the Supreme Court decision that has brought the tariff levels down, 11%. That's the highest rate we've had since 1943. And second only to what? To 1931, 32 with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. At Boston College, I did take economics. And I took more at Johns Hopkins. I was typical of a young person in the late 70s and 80s, and as a professional, all the way through till about 10 years ago, I, prayed the gospel of free trade. And I look back, and again, Professor Romer is the authority on this, be happy to hear from him about it, but there were problems with free trade, but boy, did it lift millions of boats. 800 million in China, people moving from poverty to the middle class. About half as many of that, but that's considerable in India. And the fact that globalization had its problems, but from an international economic point of view, brought us stability and prosperity that we had not seen before. I thought the turning point was 2016, when candidate Hillary Clinton came out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was President Obama's idea of a big free trade arrangement in the Indo-Pacific, the most important part of the world for the 5 largest economies on that map of the Indo-Pacific. And candidate Hillary Clinton said she was against it. Candidate Donald Trump, he was against it. And we're now very much in a protectionist frame where both President Biden and President Trump have really neutered and neutralized the World Trade Organization. It's very difficult to exercise dispute resolution there because we won't appoint judges, both the Democratic and Republican parties. And that bothers me. It bothers me because I think it reduces our influence in the world, and it gets us into a protectionist mode, which may in the short term be helpful to certain industries, but in the long term doesn't produce the growth that we need. So a world of disorder is not a world that we should want to have, but I think the bad news this morning is in those examples, we're heading towards a world without many rules. Which leads us to 3 other risk questions this morning. And the first is Iran. We're more than 2 months into the war. Our assumptions were, the government's assumptions were beginning it, that the Iranians were vulnerable, and this is a really terrible regime, and we've been struggling against this regime in every administration since Jimmy Carter, a regime that has killed well more than 1,000 Americans. I was a young diplomat in Cairo in the early 1980s, and they bombed our Marine barracks, the Iranians did, in 1983 and killed 260 Marines. They bombed our embassy and killed more people. 10 years later, I was in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, when the Iranians attacked our Air Force barracks, U.S. Air Force, killed more than 30 people. We visited 100 people in the hospital from our military. They produced and created Hezbollah and Hamas. They funded the Houthi rebels. This is a despicable regime. And the assumptions were on February 28th, they were vulnerable, and so we and the Israelis struck. The bet was that air power would overthrow the regime, that decapitating the leadership, starting with the death of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the first day of the war, and if you look at the top leadership of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia, they were all taken out. And the bet was that air power alone could accomplish it. We bombed for 38 days. The Iranian regime did not change. People 2, 3, 4 levels down just simply took the places of those larger leaders, senior leaders. And then the Iranians played their big card. They shut down the Strait of Hormuz. 40% of international energy leaves from the Strait of Hormuz or through the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, around the Arabian Peninsula. And they have cards, and they use the cards. And we have not had an effective response. And so we're in this, I think, very unfortunate position where perhaps we've overestimated the value of air power in dislodging a regime, and we've underestimated the will of this group of leaders. They're battle-tested. Many of them come from our generation, so they went through the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war, more than 1 million Iranian casualties. They're zealots, and we've not given them an exit door. President Trump's first speech on February 28th was call to the Iranian people, overthrow this regime, take to the streets. And so for them, the leaders of Iran, it became an existential battle. They were going to be killed, their families would be killed, their regime would fall if they didn't fight back, and they fought back. So what do we do now? Two big issues, and I think President Trump correctly identified the two big issues the other day in the Oval Office. Number one, the Strait of Hormuz has to be reopened without Iran as the Tony Soprano, the toll keeper, collecting $2 to $3 million of every ship that wants to pass through. One of my students, I was teaching 100 students at Harvard Business School this semester in a course that did case studies on war and peace, so we actually just interrupted the syllabus in the course and looked at this Iran war. He said to me, well, why shouldn't the Iranians be able to collect tolls? And the answer is, it's an international waterway. Much like the Taiwan Strait, there has never been in modern history a toll keeper. It's free passage. It fuels the global economy. He said, well, how about the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal? Well, they're very different. They're inland waterways. They're owned by the governments of Panama and Egypt, so they can collect tolls. But the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea, they're international waterways. We cannot allow Iran to continue to be the toll keeper. And I think the president said the other day he wouldn't let it happen. That's exactly the right way to think about it. I think he's thinking clearly about it. Our blockade is the right point of leverage. The Iranians export about 1.6 million barrels a day through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, out to the big economies of Japan and South Korea and China and India, Indonesia. And at some point, their inability to export that oil is going to be a huge point of leverage. The question is when. And if you're thinking maybe from an American mindset, you might think, well, they're rational, and at some point the pain's going to be so severe that they're going to give in. Are they rational in the Western sense? Or will they do anything? This small group of leaders, do they really care about the 93 million Iranians who have hyperinflation and can't live a normal life under these conditions? My bet is we're misjudging them, that we've misjudged their will. And this is a giant game of chicken, and that they believe, as they say, and the Taliban said the same thing to us when we got caught in Afghanistan, you have the watches, we have the time. They believe that they are tougher, that they can resist longer than we can because they know that we've got a problem with inflation. They know that we have midterm elections. They're smart about us. So I really worry about our ability to sustain this pressure so that we can end up with a ceasefire agreement that will make sure that the strait is open. The other big issue, of course, is the fact that they are trying to develop a nuclear weapon. I was, a long time ago, 20 years ago, for President George W. Bush, the Iran nuclear negotiator. We negotiated with them for 20 years, from my time until just the last couple of months. And what happened? They lied to us consistently about whether or not they had a program. We then uncovered, President Obama and President Trump, different aspects of that program. We caught them in the lie. They pledged not to seek a nuclear weapon. They pledged not to enrich highly enriched uranium, but they've done all those things. And so I actually supported President Trump in June of last year when he and the Israelis struck at the 3 major nuclear research centers in Iran, because I figured 20 years of diplomacy, they lied and cheated, the diplomacy never really succeeded. We should use surgical strikes, not against civilians, not against power stations, not against water systems, not to hurt the civilians of Iran, but the government of Iran. I thought that was correct. And there's about 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium under the rubble from June 2025, those bombings. And another key issue for President Trump, and I think he's right about this, we got to make sure the Iranians don't get access to that. So that would mean some kind of ceasefire agreement where the strait is open, no tollkeeper, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we trust that UN agency, has 24/7 eyes on that rubble and the 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium, because you need that at about 70 to 80% purification to be able, with a nuclear warhead and a ballistic missile, that's your nuclear weapon. That's what we have to prevent. This is a really tough problem. And I think Dan and Andy, I'd guess that, a lot of us hoped, and I think the president hoped, this war would end in a week or two. Here we are on May 1. I'd be very surprised if we resolve this by June. We may be in this for a couple of more months because we're dealing with a group of people who are not on our timeline. So that's Iran. Third issue to talk about after World of Disorder and Iran. Am I depressing everybody? I'm looking out at some somber faces. I'm going to end on hope, and I'll tell you why I'm going to end on hope. 7 or 8 years ago, I was asked to give an evening lecture to a group of Harvard students. Tell us about risk and all the problems of the world. And my wife, Libby, made the huge mistake of coming to listen to me. And we were walking home in Cambridge, Massachusetts afterwards, and I very innocently turned to her and said, "How did that go?" And there was a pause. And she said, "You are depressing everybody." And I said, "What do you mean I'm depressing everybody?" She said, "I get there are 1,000 problems in the world, but these are young people. You need to give them hope. You're a professor. Come on." And it was a big teaching moment for me, Andy. It really was. And so I promised Libby, every time I speak, I've got 3 things that I'm very hopeful about. So I'm going to get there. World of Disorder, Iran, huge problem. Putin. Why have we become Putin's lawyer? Why have we deserted Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian people? That's where we are. And I think if you polled 340 million Americans, are we for Ukraine or Russia? I think I know who wins that. If you polled every Republican in Congress, secret poll, I think we know how they would vote. You have this valiant group of people, 54 million Ukrainians, who were attacked. And you remember the first day? Everybody, including me, felt the Russians' armored column would roll into Kiev, take down the government, execute Zelensky and his advisors, and just kill the country, kill the Ukrainian nation. Remember what happened that first day? At dawn, Zelensky, with an iPhone and 4 or 5 of his guys around him, he said in Ukrainian to the Ukrainian people, "I'm here. I did not flee. we're going to fight back. A lot of people think now, this was a Wall Street Journal reflection last weekend, is he now the leader of the West? And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I really don't. I'm not trying to politicize this towards President Trump or anybody else. But who else has stood up for democracy, for freedom, more than Zelensky and his associates over the last 4 years and 3 months of this terrible war? 7 or 8 million Ukrainian refugees. Our oldest daughter, Sarah, lives in Berlin and has been working with Ukrainian refugees. Men and women dying in battle for their country. And until 15 months ago, we were supporting Ukraine. Now Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, very able people, they've made 9 trips to Moscow, 0 trips to Ukraine. And here's the old CW, the old conventional wisdom. You remember the scene in the Oval Office, February 2025, when the President and Vice President Vance hosted President Zelensky, and they berated him. Why aren't you thanking us? But they also said, President Trump said to him publicly, you don't have any cards. You need to fold. You need to cave. Give in to Putin's demands. You know what Putin's demands are? I'll give you a ceasefire, Ukraine, if you give me land in eastern Ukraine that the Russian army hasn't even gained in battle. So voluntarily give up part of your national territory. And quite correctly, Zelensky said no. What's the new conventional wisdom? Well, the old was, Ukraine's going to lose the war. It can't resist the Russian army. Here's the new conventional wisdom. Talk to any military analyst over the last 3 or 4 months. Ukraine is now winning on the battlefield because of what Dan mentioned. AI-enabled drone technology, sophisticated missiles, striking at Russian oil and gas facilities, striking at the export facilities up on the Baltic Sea near St. Petersburg, draining Russian economic power. And so the Ukrainians now are ahead in the war. They're the side we should root for, and yet we are still trying to coerce them into a deal that nobody should expect, to give up their national territory. I don't get it. And I'll bet the majority of Americans don't get it either. I hope there's a change of heart. I really hope there's a reconsideration. Mitch McConnell's been so courageous on this. Lindsey Graham has been courageous on this. Senior Republicans saying there's only one side to support here. So that's the third issue I just wanted to put on the floor for our conversation. And very briefly, because as Dan said, at Boston College or Harvard or any place else, we could spend a whole year talking about any one of these issues. But here are the big issues of risk for all of us, particularly in the business community. It's the world of disorder. It's obviously the Iran war. It's obviously the Ukraine war, which is existentially important to the United States. It's not just peripheral. And it's obviously China. And I'll end on China. I think we have a structural rivalry underway. We're the 2 largest economies in the world. We're the 2 strongest militaries in the world. We're the only 2 countries that have true global reach, the ability to affect everybody else in the world. And we both want to be number 1. And only one of us can be number 1. And I don't think there's anyone in this room who wants Xi Jinping's communist China to be the number 1 power in the world 10 years from now. And so if you break that down, we are competing, and this is an epic competition across 4 broad areas. We're competing for who's going to be the strongest military in the most important part of the world. That's the Indo-Pacific. I should have brought a map. Indo-Pacific, Arabian Peninsula, east coast of Africa, Arabian Sea, subcontinent, Bay of Bengal, Strait of Malacca, North Asia, the big economies, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, west coast of the United States. We have someone here from Portland, Oregon, who I met coming in, parent of one of our Carroll School students. That's the Indo-Pacific. 4 strongest militaries in the world on that map. United States, China, Japan, and India. 4 of the 5 leading economies in the world, with the exception of the EU, on that map. It's the power map. And China wants to dominate the power map. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, pushing out South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, Yellow Sea, Himalayan border with India, pushing out illegally beyond their territorial limits to colonize Vietnamese, Filipino, South Korean islands. We've got to be there with our treaty allies to be that line of defense and deterrence against the PLA pushing out. That's competition number one. Number two is probably the most important competition, and that's technology. And that's now center stage in the US-China competition. If you think about artificial intelligence, just a couple of examples, the battle for who's going to be first to a quantum supercomputer, struggles over who's going to be most advanced in synthetic biology, cyber, we were talking, Professor Romer and I, just before we began, about the huge investments China is making in cyber, and they're in our networks here in the United States. And of course, space, which of course, who's going to be first to land human beings again on the moon sometime late this decade, early the next. That competition is playing out in technology. And what's interesting about it is during the Second World War and most of the Cold War, governments owned the big technology, nuclear weapons. But all of this technology competition rests on the private sectors of both countries. All of the talent and innovation and building of products is really happening in the private sector. So I used to tell my team in Beijing at our embassy, we've got to go all out and support the American tech companies in their battle with both the Chinese government, which is funding their tech companies, and the Chinese tech companies. So that's second area of competition. Third is trade and investment. And both President Biden and President Trump have believed that a certain level of tariffs have to be put on the Chinese because of unfair trade practices, intellectual property rights violations, forced technology transfer. That's a third area of competition. A fourth is what we should be good at, and that's the battle of ideas. Our big idea, July 4th, 1776, Walter Isaacson, the historian, has a new book. He said it's the most important sentence ever written in human history. And I'm going to modify Jefferson. All men and women are created equal. That's our big idea. But right now, the Chinese big idea is an authoritarian state works better. It builds infrastructure better. It lifts people out of poverty better. I don't believe all this. I contest it, but that's what they believe. And they have made a better effort in getting that message out to the rest of the world than we have, because we destroyed USAID. Elon Musk and the Doge people, in 2 weeks, fired 10,000 people in a government agency. They demolished it. They sent someone down to Constitution Avenue to actually chisel out the words U.S. Agency for International Development. And we destroyed Voice of America. And I found in the later stages of my ambassadorship, they were getting their message out more effectively than we were. So boy, this is competition. And I think China is the strongest adversary we've ever faced in 250 years of American history. Certainly stronger than Nazi Germany, regional power, Imperial Japan, definitely stronger because of their economic strength than the Soviet Union ever was. And Xi Jinping is on a mission. Highly intelligent, highly strategic, patient, building Chinese power in these 4 areas against the United States. So I really hope that we can marshal a bipartisan effort, and I felt that support from both Republicans and Democrats. It's the one issue, China policy, that has support from both parties. I hope we can maintain that bipartisan effort. My successor is a very good man, David Perdue. He was a U.S. Senator from Georgia. He's now the American ambassador to China, and I'm supporting David. And you know, it was almost like a handoff when I left on fentanyl. We were working on that together, on all these areas of competition. I felt I handed the baton to him, and President Biden handed it to President Trump. And I think the Trump and Biden policies are remarkably similar when it comes to China. But there's a lot more to say about this, but this is a really difficult set of issues for the United States. I should say one more thing. Both President Trump and President Biden have also said, we're going to compete And that's going to be the focus of American power. Probably 80% of my team and my effort was on the competitive edge. We do have to work with them when our interests are aligned, and they align on climate change. I'm a climate science acceptor. I don't deny the science. I accept it. China's 33% of global emissions. We're about 11. They're rising. We're falling, but we're number 1 and 2. And every president, but President Trump, has decided we need to work together. We're no longer doing that. I hope that'll be reconsidered. Certainly, I think by any successor to President Trump and the Democratic or Republican side, we can't deny the truth and data and science and facts. And finally, what has united Donald Trump and Joe Biden is we have to live in peace with China. We live in the nuclear weapons world. We live in a world of chemical weapons. Who knows what AI is going to bring in terms of destructive human technology? We have to live in peace with China. And it's good to see both presidents be so forthright in saying that. So I have taken you on a journey about risk, about challenge that we Americans face. We need to shore up a world order of rules and institutions and guardrails. We need to make sure Iran does not succeed in the Strait of Hormuz. We should want to make sure that Putin doesn't succeed in Ukraine. And we have to be very smart about China, because our strongest competitor is also a partner, and we have to live in peace. And that means we have to have diplomacy in the forefront with China. I'm not depressed about our future. I told you 3 quick things about hope. I'm really hopeful about our young people, and I don't just say this to be nice in a university setting, but I spend all my time now with young people, 20s and 30s. They are purposeful, they're service-centered, they want to make a difference. I work with a lot of Harvard Business School students, like the BC students. There's nothing more important than strengthening the American private sector. And that's why I'm hopeful. That's hopeful point number 2. I tried to meet every CEO who came through China. We have 10,000 American companies in China. We have thousands more exporting or importing into and from China. And we are banking on the private sector to be our most effective agent globally, in a world of technology transformation, but also in this US-China relationship. And the CEOs and other board members whom I met from across the spectrum of American industry couldn't have been more impressive. And I think that's a unique advantage of the United States these days. Almost the rise of the private sector as this critical group of leaders in a world that's changing so profoundly. Third and finally, so we can look out in the sun and be a little bit more brighter on a Friday morning. We've been a remarkably fortunate country as we think about 250 years since July 4th, 1776. I just think of 3 times we were very fortunate. One was March 1865. 700,000 Americans dead. The Civil War nearly over. And what did Lincoln say in his second inaugural? With malice toward none, with charity toward all, let us bind up the wounds of our nation. He was saying the Confederates are our brothers and sisters. We're bringing them back into the fold. Grant promised Lee at Appomattox, your soldiers can return on their horses with their sidearms because they have to go plow the fields in the spring of 1865. What luminous leadership from our greatest president. And then fast forward to the Depression and World War II, how fortunate that we had Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And maybe his greatest skill was he gave us confidence that we could get through. It's our mom and dad's generation. They would get through it. And then I think of Ronald Reagan, and I have to admit, I didn't vote for him when I was a young BC graduate in 1980 or in 84. I look back at him, though I served in his administration. We were lucky for Reagan, because the great crisis of Dan and Andy and my generation, Vietnam and Watergate, I think Americans felt unconfident about our future back in the late 70s, early 80s. And Reagan gave us confidence that we really are a great nation, that our private sector is the engine of our nation in many ways. So may we get lucky again, find redemption. This is a good Catholic thought. When we face problems, or we screw up, or we make mistakes, as we do in a democratic society, but move forward. I have that confidence we'll do that. Thank you very much.
So we've got about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. There's not very much to unpack in all of that, Mr. Ambassador, but we have some actual PhD students who are going to be coming around with microphones, so they're very well qualified to do this task. So think about your questions. You know, your comment on hope, I just wanted to emphasize something. We're sponsoring today a hackathon down at Stanford University, Shield Capital is, and we got a set of problem sets from the Department of War for these people to work on. And we thought we might get a few people sign up and come and work on some of these things. We had 1,000 of some of the brightest engineers in the country come to work on these problem sets for 3 days. So there is a sense of change that would not have happened 10 years ago in Silicon Valley because of Project Maven and a lot of other things. But there is a sea change in this generation's approach to solving problems in the world. So, all right, who's got a question? I think the gentleman right over here raised right by the screen. Yep.
Oh, thank you. My name is Wayne Johnson. I graduated from here in 1971. I'm probably the oldest guy in the room, but I worked in the private sector my whole life, and I had the privilege and the opportunity to set up HP's strategic partnership in China with the private sector and the universities. And one thing that I don't think is discussed very much, I'm a big believer of the role of the private sector, but China is investing much more money in science and technology than we are. And they are ahead of us in many areas. Meanwhile, we're cutting back the National Science Foundation, the NIH, all these places where it makes a big difference. What are your thoughts about what China is doing there? And isn't that an issue we should be concerned about?
Thank you very much for your question. I agree with you. And I think it's our biggest challenge. If technology is the transformative set of issues of our time, we have to remind ourselves what made us the great industrial power. This is a Walter Isaacson thought. He says, think of a triangle, is what you said. The federal government sits at the top point. It funds our research universities all across the United States and the incubation of ideas, innovation, then monetized by the private sector on the third leg of the triangle. Think Manhattan Project. Think the industrial economy of World War II. Think Gemini. Think Apollo. Think the creation of the internet. This all happened because of the virtuous triangle that you described. And it is exceedingly painful for me. It was to be sitting in China watching this very smart group of people that lead the Communist Party. We should not underestimate them. They are very smart people. They're purposeful. And because they're autocrats, they can plan 10 to 15 to 20 years in the future and make big bets on industries. And the week I left, I was telling Andy and others and Dan at breakfast, Xi Jinping put $15 billion into 2 quantum companies in China that they felt would be the best competitors against the American quantum companies. And so they're making deep, targeted, long-term investments. What are we doing? Historic reductions in science and technology, research and development funding into our universities. And frankly, I don't think this is the will of the Congress. This is the policy of the Trump administration, but I have to admit, the levels were falling under President Biden and President Obama. So we have a two-party problem here, which has been exacerbated over the last 15 months, but it was present before. And when Walter, whom I admire, Isaacson says, we got to remember what made us great, that's what made us great. And if you think about technology, we've been talking about that this morning, there's all the more reason we've got to double down on our university spending, research. We feel it at Harvard. My brother is a professor at the medical school. To take away federal government contracting for Alzheimer's research, for cancer research, I mean, it's just not right. I love the government. I served in it for 31 years. We do not have the capacity in the government to conduct this research, but the universities do. And so I'm with you. We need a national effort to try to get those spending levels back up. And if we don't, I think we're going to see the Chinese in many different tech categories. There'll be a real competitor. I didn't mean to say virtuous. There'll be a competitor, and they may surpass us. And that's where power is going to come from in the next 10 or 20 years. So thank you.
In the back, the gentleman with his hand up far against the wall.
Hi, Murray Jocelyn from San Diego, and proud parent of a Carroll School graduate in a few days, I hope, and a junior. But wonderful to be with you. Thank you for your tremendously insightful comments. I wonder if you could just make a comment on a country you didn't briefly mention, which is the second most populous country in the world, India, and whether they continue to be able to sit on the sidelines or become a pawn or a player in these world conflicts.
Thank you very much. And actually, India, I think, according to the United Nations, has now surpassed China as the largest country in the world by population, 1.4 billion people. Most demographies think that China is probably now 1.1 or 1.2 billion. They've lost. Some of the projections, and demographics is so important as a measure of national power, have China going down to maybe 800 or 750 million people by mid-century, just past mid-century, because of the one-child policy, but also the very low, historically low birth rates. And I teach a course on great powers, and we actually do a unit on demography and demographics as a function of power. And if you think about the declining birth rates, Japan, Korea, China, Russia, Europe, our birth rate is slightly above all of those countries, but not by a margin. But why are we the second youngest great power after India? Immigration, legal immigration. I'm not talking about illegal immigration across the southern border, but people who come to Boston College and they're a foreign student and they work for an American company after Boston College. They get a green card and they take the oath of citizenship after 5 years in this country. We were taking in about 1 million legal immigrants until this past year, and I'm trying to be analytical, not political, but these are facts. We've now basically shut down that flow of legal immigration, and I think from a national security perspective, it's a very important issue to reflect about. We are stronger because of these legal immigrants, and they're almost all highly educated. Look who's running a lot of our tech companies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Seaport, but also in California. Indian Americans, Chinese Americans. So I just wanted to take advantage of your question about India by making that point. I think the biggest strategic move we have made as a country from Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Trump in his first term, Biden, has been the idea that India is a big strategic partner of the United States, both economically, but more importantly, as a military partner. We conduct more military exercises with India and the Bay of Bengal and the Western Pacific than we do with Japan or Korea. And India has a major problem with China, a 2,500 kilometer border dispute in the Himalayas, where China contests the sovereignty of a major Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. And so we've tried to double down on this. It's unfortunate to see that now we a year ago, put 50% tariffs on India. They're now down to, I think, 25%. This, to me, is a tactical mistake of the first order. We need India to help limit Chinese power in the world. They won't be so inclined if we just judge them on their highly protectionist economy. Professor Romer can say more about this. He knows more about it, I'm sure, than I do. But there's a trade-off here. Indian help in containing and limiting China versus trying to open up the Indian market. You want to do both, but one's more important than the other. And I think, again, if you polled the Congress, this is what's so ironic about our national debate. I think I've said some nice things about the president, and I meant them. I think he's made some good decisions in many areas. But this is a major mistake to basically sideline India, which is what has happened over the last 15 months.
I got time for one or two more. Right here, Peter.
Nick, could you talk about
If you wait for the mic for 1 second.
Could you talk a little bit about the EU and its future and its role? Because it seems to almost be fading away, but it's a huge economy.
Yeah, the EU is 500 million people. I think it's a very big economy, second to the United States. I think if you take all the EU countries together, the attachment by the people of the EU to the EU has remained fixed. If you look at the public opinion polls in Central Europe, particularly in Western Europe, Zelensky's big ambition is to get Ukraine admitted into the EU to stabilize it and cement Ukraine's place in Europe. The problem is the democratic backsliding, the weakness of the democracies, and the allure of authoritarian political parties. I mean, if they win a series of elections, you could see far-right governments in Germany and in France and in Britain in the next 5 to 10 years. I hope that doesn't happen. So it's a weak moment for the EU. And I think President Trump did something good by saying to the NATO allies, almost all of whom, with a couple of exceptions, are also members of the European Union, you need to spend more than 1% of your gross domestic product on defense. That was a big Trump victory, first term, second term. All these countries, Peter, have pledged to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense, an additional 1.5 on military infrastructure, because we've got to face the Indo-Pacific. We've got to make sure that we're strong enough to limit Chinese power, and we've got to get out of the Middle East and stop getting caught in the quicksand of Middle East wars. So the Europeans will take on a larger role in defense, and that's spurring major investments in the EU defense industry in Germany and Italy, in Poland, and the United Kingdom. But part of this is NATO, we're part of NATO. And I was ambassador to NATO, as Andy and Dan said, on 9/11. And when we were hit really hard, I tried to call with my team the White House State Department, Defense Department that morning of 9/11. If there are New Yorkers here who experienced this, you'll never forget it. None of us ever will. All those buildings had been evacuated because Flight 93, they feared, was heading towards Washington. And my phone rang 2 hours after the attack, and it was David Wright, the Canadian ambassador. And he said to me, "We're with you." And Canadians thought, we can get all of NATO to support you. We knew it was Osama bin Laden, and we'll invoke Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. And by the next morning, they'd all agreed. I called Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, who has in many ways been my professional mentor, a very close friend, and I said, the Allies want to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I said, thank you, Condi. I actually called to get the President's personal instruction to vote for Article 5 because it was an act of war. She said, go for it. I tried a third time to say, Condi, thank you, but can President Bush just give me the authority to vote for this? She said, he's had a really bad day. It was 4 in the morning in Washington. She said, go for it. I said, I'll take that as my personal instruction, presidential instruction. She said, right. She said, but there's one more thing. And I've never forgotten what she said. She said, it's good to have friends in the world. At a moment like that. So now we are pushing those friends away. And I'm just going to be objective and analytical. I'm not trying to score points, but these are facts. When you threaten to invade a NATO ally in Greenland as part of the Kingdom of Denmark, when you question Canadian sovereignty not once, but 10 times, when you threaten, well, you call them cowards because they didn't come into the war that we started and didn't tell them about, we are breaking the bonds of trust with our NATO allies. And I think as we look towards the future, we got 2 big problems. Contain Putin and limit China. We are so much stronger with NATO than without them. Churchill said, and he had the best quotes for every situation, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And again, President Trump's done some good things for our economy, thinking about technology. I think he's been largely right, Dan, in letting our tech companies go forward to compete without excessive regulation. But when you turn your allies against you, that in the long term, is going to do grievous harm to the United States. We want to have friends. And we have 31 NATO allies and 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific. And that's the difference between China, Russia, and the United States. We are more powerful with them than without them. So your question allows me to make that mini speech and encourage us all to be faithful to these longtime allies of the U.S.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Mr. Ambassador, we could go on for much longer. I can think of few people in the world as qualified to discuss these issues as Ambassador Burns. So a round of applause for Ambassador.
Thank you very much.